Well. Willkommen to Irreverend with me.
Hang on a second, Jamie. Why did you do that strange thing with your voice? No, you keep recording. It's all right. This is banter.
I'm slightly disconcerted, Tom. I thought you liked my introductions.
Okay. No, I do like them.
I can't believe you didn't find that instantly hilarious.
It's sort of hilarious, I guess, to a degree.
Okay, all right. I'm not sure whether something can be hilarious to a degree, but in any case, let's.
Oh, you could do that again. All right.
Let's start from the top. Although we are recording this on video this week, so we can't start from the top. But welcome everybody to this new and very, very special episode of Irreverend, because you may be listening to us via the podcast, but if all the technology has survived, you may also be watching, that's right, watching us on YouTube. And if you are watching us, you'll see that I've got a very normal background, the kind of background that you would expect a priest in the Church of England to have. Whereas if you look at Tom, he appears to actually be violating the stay-at-home order and sitting outdoors in some kind of graveyard in front of a church. Tom, do you want to explain what's going on?
Well, do you know what, Jamie? My office is not that tidy. I'm not a very tidy office person. I leave things all over the place. So I thought that I would have a background, and I wanted the background as if I was on the International Space Station, but Jamie said it would be too disconcerting. So I found this, which is a picture of St Mary's on Brownsea Island, which is an island in Poole Harbour, of course, where the Scouts had their first campsite. They're very famous for that, and it is basically not inhabited anymore, but used to have a thriving community on it. It was cleared out after the war.
Oh yeah, I remember. I've been there, Tom. I'm not on the island. I've been to the where Harry Redknapp's house is on the coast.
Well, Sandbanks. That's across.
Yeah, but you can see that island. Yeah. Carry on.
You can. And it's a very beautiful island. It's very peaceful, and it's got a church on it, which is still a functioning church. Before the pandemic, used to have weekly services, and once upon a time served the community of the island, which was about sort of 150 people. Farm workers and pottery workers.
Yeah.
House staff for the large castle that was there. But now is mostly just for for the sake of it, really. There's about 16 permanent residents of the island, and when there's a service, some of them turn up, but mostly we keep, it's a good, I think it's a good thing to have running, just to sort of entice people in, preach the word of the Lord on Brownsea Island, and it's used by scouts and guides occasionally as well, I think.
Precisely. But you're not actually on the island, are you, Tom? I think that's important to clarify.
No, I'm not.
You are in your...
In case any of our listeners, or indeed watchers, were worried that I would be breaking a rule so egregiously.
Endangering the 60 residents of the island, Tom, with your...
16. 16.
Well, even more reason that they should be protected.
Yeah.
Well, it's in any case, we want to say a big hello to our viewers, if we have any, which hopefully we do, because we're going to share this around. It's good to have viewers and listeners, particularly if you are new. We welcome you to this big Irreverend family, and we hope that you enjoy the show. We've got a lot of interesting stuff coming up today. Actually some sort of news, really. I was joking with my wife that this is ostensibly a kind of news and current affairs podcast that's hosted by two people who don't actually watch the news. So I think that might be, apart from the fact that we're reverends, I think that might be our USP, really, isn't it? That we are probably the most ignorant broadcasters when it comes to current events, to actually make a program. What do you think of that, Tom?
Well, I mean, to be honest, Jamie, in the last few weeks, I've gradually cut myself more and more off from the news, and it's been great for my mental health. So what we're going to talk about, I don't know. Apparently, I think COVID's still going on.
Apparently, yeah.
I assume so. I saw a government advert billboard that said stay at home, save lives, protect the NHS, which I thought was a year ago. I thought that was the first movement, but apparently that's back again.
It still needs protecting.
And I saw another one which said everyone can spread the disease.
Yes.
And my favourite one was the virus thrives on human contact. And I thought, do you know what else thrives on human contact? Humans thrive on human contact. In fact, without human contact, humans don't thrive. So whether we are sort of cutting off probably an arm rather than a nose, despite the face, a nose seems rather minor compared to some things that have happened.
Yeah.
That's my so from those 3 billboards, I surmise that there's still a pandemic, and also from the fact that I cannot find a new graphics card for my computer anywhere, I surmise that something's going on in the world.
Yes, a run on graphics cards.
Do you know why? Actually, it's more interesting than you think it is, Jamie, and I can tell you that because Bitcoin is at an all-time high. And whenever Bitcoin gets high, people buy graphics cards to mine it. They set their computers off on loose on cryptographic problems in order to make themselves Bitcoins, which they can then spend. And it just so happens that the same technology for making visuals render swiftly on a computer screen also means that you can mine Bitcoins very swiftly. So basically, there was a huge run on graphics cards, and there are now none to be found in the country.
Wow.
I'm not even joking. There's none to be found.
I know you're not joking. And indeed, this is jeopardizing this entire podcast because you haven't been able to get a new graphics card, and your old one is conking out. So it might conk out any moment, which would render this entire enterprise utterly trivial and defunct. And Tom, let me just say, I think that we're sort of joking about this thing about cutting yourself off from the news, but I really think it's so important. You know, I feel so much better since I've been massively limiting the amount of news that I've been watching. You know, going on Twitter far less and just cutting myself off from it. I feel so much better. And like we were saying last week, it just makes you realize how much your sense of reality is shaped by watching the news and being inculcated with the messages that come to us through the media. Look, friends, just cut yourself off. Just cut yourself off. It's so much better. You don't need to know any of this stuff. You know, the stuff that you need to know, you can hear in about 10 seconds. You know, somebody can just tell you, oh, did you know, there's another strain or, whatever. It doesn't matter. You don't need to know all this stuff all the time. And it just makes the soul sick. So, if you are a follower of Christ, especially, meditate on things which are edifying and which are going to build you up, and not things which are going to make you feel stressed and annoyed and angry and bring about the fruit of the works of the flesh but rather seek the fruit of the Holy Spirit. And of course, if you're not a Christian, I'm sure there's an application there as well. So that's how it's kind of like we're becoming a sort of self-help program, really, rather than a faith in current affairs. But I'm sure our listeners will appreciate that. Tom, have you seen anything good, or have you had any good experiences over the last week? I've got something to share, but I want to hear yours first.
I had a very lovely funeral yesterday, must be said.
Right.
Listeners might find that strange, but actually, I think it's really important to acknowledge that you can have nice funerals. You can have these beautiful. This is a beautiful funeral of a lady who I knew quite well, who died as 97. She had a sort of firm faith and a mind that always sought out God.
Very good.
She worked for SOE in the war, running Polish. She was a secretary basically for the Polish SOE workers in France.
Tom, obviously I know what SOE means, but for anyone who doesn't know what that stands for, can you?
Special Operations Executive. They were the sort of behind enemy lines kind of organization that managed kind of cell groups in not Bible cell groups, but fighting cell groups behind who sabotaged the German war effort, and she was particularly involved with Polish workers on the northern French railways.
Wow.
Which was just really interesting. Anyway, lovely to hear about her life, but also just to celebrate a life lived in the love of God. So that was uplifting.
Great. Well, that's a great example of courage, isn't it? And courage is a virtue which we don't celebrate in our society. In fact, we in many ways celebrate the opposite of courage, which is cowardice and fear. So any stories like this where we hear about people who actually risked their lives in order to fight against evil is very inspiring. And I really think it's important that we teach the younger generation, especially, the value of courage, because without courage, as Thomas Aquinas says, you can't do any good, because you'll be afraid of death or other negative consequences. So you must have courage. So thanks for that, Tom. That's an inspirational story. I watched a really interesting film called The Dig. Have you heard of this film?
No, I haven't. No.
Yeah, it's got Ray Fiennes and Carey Mulligan as the two main actors, and I really like both of these people, and so watched this as soon as it was released on Netflix. It's a story about Basil Brown, who is the archaeologist who discovered first the Sutton Hoo treasure which was found near Ipswich. He's played by Ray Fiennes, and it's a really lovely story about the relationship of Basil Brown with the lady who contracts him to undergo this work. Really, really moving. I don't want to say too much about it. There's a kind of a subplot with Lily James, who seems to be in absolutely everything, and what's his name? Johnny Flynn. Do you know this actor? He's a tall, thin
man, I don't know.
Blonde hair. He was in the recent Emma adaptation. He looks scarily like a school friend of mine, but I'm fairly sure he's not him, although he could be. I don't know, actually. Anyway, so that subplot's a little bit like, not really sure if he needs that. But the actual overall plot and the acting of Ray Fiennes and Carey Mulligan is fantastic. So highly recommended. We all need things to do in these days in the evenings, because, of course, we can't go anywhere. So I would recommend that you watch The Dig if you want something to watch.
That sounds like a nice idea. I started watching a film with Sarah this week. It's very hard to watch a film with a 7-week-old baby. It must be said, because they do tend to interrupt it frequently, and it wasn't the right film, Jamie. I mean, it's a great film. You've probably seen it. Cold Mountain. Have you seen Cold Mountain?
I've never watched Cold Mountain.
You've never watched Cold Mountain? Okay.
No.
Do you know, it's a really good film. Wait.
No, I have. I was sorry, Tom. I was thinking of Brokeback Mountain.
No, not Brokeback Mountain. No,
I have seen that. Remind me what happens in it.
So it's about a soldier at the tail end of the American Civil War, having been wounded, returning to his fiancée and beloved at Cold Mountain.
Who plays the soldier?
Do you know what, Jamie? I have no idea. I don't know. There's an actor, right? They've got different names in everything I watch, so I can never really follow it, who they are. But Sarah assures me that he's in other films as well. Do you know what? I'll look it up for you, Jamie. There's a computer in front of me. It is played by... Yeah, Cold Mountain. It's played by Jude Law.
Yeah, Jude Law.
I've heard that name before.
Yeah.
I presume he's known, is he?
He's a British actor, yeah.
Okay. And it's got another lady who I heard of before, Nicole Kidman.
Yeah. She's probably one of the sort of 4 or 5 most famous actresses in the world, I would say.
Right. Okay. Well, I've seen one film with her in, and so. And
what happened then?
I really don't. So yeah, he tries to get home basically, and it's very sad. It's very sad all the way through.
Yeah.
And I was already feeling a little bit sad, because I think everyone feels a bit sad every now and again, and it just made me feel doubly sad and miserable. So I stopped watching, even though it's a great film. So that's not a feel-good story, Jamie. We shouldn't have gone with that. But I'm sorry.
It's fine. It's interesting to hear about that. And I watched that film at the cinema. I think I watched it at the cinema at the University of Kent, which is called the Gulbenkian Cinema. I have a vague memory of watching it 15 years ago or something. Well, maybe not that long, but something like that. But well, thanks for that, Tom. If anyone wants to feel sad by watching a good film, then Cold Mountain. So that's the film criticism part of the show finished with. I'm just trying.
We're about as good at film criticism as we are at current affairs, actually, Jamie. Come to think of it, seeing as I don't watch films.
Yeah, I mean, at least I can remember the people's names in the films. I mean, to not know who Nicole Kidman is pretty unbelievable, really. Anyway, before we go any further down this rabbit hole, I can't really think of any other personal news that I'd like to share this week, Tom. It was my birthday last week. I was 34, and I watched a rather depressing Spurs performance where they lost against Liverpool terribly in the evening. So I had a lovely Indian takeaway, but it was bitter. Turned to ashes in my mouth because of the pathetic performance of my football team. So I don't really want to think about that. Anyway.
I must say, Jamie, that I vaguely follow Southampton, and I checked my Google phone this morning to discover that they've been completely and utterly annihilated by Manchester United, which is not very fair, really, because I didn't even think Manchester United were very good anymore. So,
well, I mean, look, Tom, Southampton have been really good this year, and also they were very unlucky last night, from what I understand. So don't write them off. But let's not talk too much about football, because people who don't like football, they get very annoyed. They say, "Oh, this isn't relevant to me," etc. So please don't switch off. We're going to talk about something else a bit more relevant now. We could always do a podcast extra where we discuss football. But again,
I wouldn't know anything about it.
Similar dynamic where I know loads of stuff and you don't even know the names of the teams. Anyway, so so quite a lot of stuff's been going on this week. As we said, there was this big disclosure or sort of leak from some document in the Church of England. There was also a big Cambridge Union lockdown debate, which I'd like to talk about a little bit. Which of those do you think we should talk about first, Tom? Where should we go?
Well, let's start with the Church of England.
Let's go for it.
Yeah, let's do it.
All right. So I've got to be honest with you, I'm just signing into my Telegraph account. Do you have an account with the Telegraph, Tom?
I don't anymore. No, sorry. But the gist of it is the Church of England is expecting to lose a fifth of its congregation and have to cut the number of clergy by 20% as a result of this pandemic. But as always, it's not really the fault of a virus, is it? We should say the result of the churches and the government's sort of response to the pandemic is going to cause serious damage to the Church of England. Well, we said this before. It's hardly surprising. If you close your churches, you basically say these are not required. You don't need to do it, and people are going to come to the reasonable conclusion that church is not required.
Yes.
It's not necessary to go to it. You can watch it online or just not do it at all. I suspect quite a lot of people are doing. You can just why bother? And of course, to a certain mindset in the church, this is all good stuff as well, because they can then justify closing their churches and not paying clergy, because a certain proportion of the church is clerical kind of. I say clerical, not in the sort of, not the clergy, but the the diocesan staff are sort of quite desire the reduction in numbers of clergy, because we're quite expensive, and the reduction in numbers of churches because they're very expensive. But of course, it just leads to more retreat. It doesn't serve the gospel well, I would argue.
It also makes you wonder what the money is actually for. If it's not for paying clergy or for keeping church buildings open, what exactly does the Church of England have money for? Is it just to employ more diocesan staff? In which case, what do they do? If they're not serving churches, just seems to be, it's a little bit bizarre, isn't it? It's a little bit like McDonald's saying, well, we could spend money on making hamburgers, but it's very expensive. It's
I think weird. The church's money is an interesting one, isn't it? And I don't think we should go into it too much depth, because the history of the church's finances is a sorry tale, really, going right the way back to the Reformation, where it was the obviously joyful transition from away from the Catholic Church was sadly seized upon by certain monarchs to grab all the church's land.
And Thomas Cranmer.
Well, yeah, and Thomas Cranmer, yeah.
And various clerics as well. It wasn't just Henry. But anyway, sorry, we won't get into that.
No, we won't. But so the church has ever since, so prior to the medieval to the Reformation, the medieval church was pretty well funded. It had a lot of it basically funded itself through chantry chapels. Which, if any of you, our listeners or watchers, are familiar with a parish church, the chapels down the side have often disappeared now. But where you had a side aisle, there would have been a series of chapels often, and they'd have all been served by a priest to say masses for the dead, or other chantry would sort of funds would have been paid for choirs to sing at those masses, or for candles to light at those masses. Effectively, the church.
I used to, sorry to interrupt you, Tom, but I used to, so the chantry chapel is largely still there in medieval cathedrals, aren't there? And I used to have as a responsibility when I was a verger the cleaning of Cardinal Beaufort's chantry chapel, and he was a very powerful man whose main, I think he was a Chancellor of England, but one of his, and he was a cardinal in the church, but one of his main claims to fame was that he oversaw the burning of Joan of Arc, and the cathedral actually placed the statue of Joan of Arc near his chantry chapel, looking at him. So it's kind of this ironic thing, you know. You burnt me, but here I am in your cathedral looking at you. Anyway, so sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No. Yeah, I think we shouldn't dwell on this too long. But anyway, ever since then, there's been problems with the finances of the church, and once upon a time. So if we're going back a few hundred years,
a long time to make this point. Sorry, carry on.
Oh no, okay. Sorry. I often
always had financial problems after the Reformation, right?
Yes. And and if our listeners are interested in a potted history of Glebland, we'll do that in another show. Yeah, so extra. The least listened to podcast ever. This is the problem, Jamie. If we stray away from current affairs, I'm basically stuck in the 50s.
Tom, I've got the current affair up here, right here on the.
Right. Okay. Anyway. Okay.
You're going to carry on with this?
No, I don't know where I'm going, Jamie. I've forgotten the point I was going to make. So, basically, the financial situation of the church has been perilous for a long time, and the church's commissioners' trust holds a lot of money for on behalf of dioceses and individual churches that were seized from the churches and dioceses in the 60s. In order to centralize and make it more efficient. Unfortunately, what it's led to is those dioceses having less money and the financial situation overall getting worse, because now the Commissioner's Trust basically holds all the money and makes more money using the money, and you have to go, begging with a cap in hand to them if you want it.
Yes. Yeah, and this move towards ever greater centralization is, of course, it's not just a problem in our society, but it's a problem in the church as well, isn't it? With this kind of this decision making, which is increasingly, I don't know, is undevolved a word? What's the opposite of devolved? The opposite of devolved. Everything's becoming more centralized, and the center is accruing more and more power to itself in order to.
Which is a problem. Which is a real problem, and it's not very biblical either. I think we had in the reading today, we were celebrating a slightly unknown saint.
Ansgar.
I can't remember his name.
Ansgar.
Yeah.
Bishop of was it Copenhagen? He was a missionary to the Nordic people in the 9th century. Can you imagine a more fearsome group of people to be a missionary to than the Swedes and the Danes in the 9th century?
Yeah, I mean, obviously a holy and interesting. He was an interesting man. But the point is, we had the reading from Mark of the sending out of the 12, where Jesus says, off you go, basically, do these things. He doesn't say, stick around and we'll talk about it, or, make sure you write me a letter every 2 days to make sure that I approve of what you're doing or whatever. He radically decentralizes the mission of the church. He says, go out there, preach the repentance to the world.
I'm not sure about that, Tom. I think I might be stretching that passage a little bit. I would be more interested. I mean, not that I wasn't interested. Not that I wasn't interested in what you just said, but I would be more interested in an exegesis of the image of the body in 1 Corinthians 12, right, where each individual part has a role to play and has an important part to play. But a body is neither centralized nor decentralized, isn't it? It's interdependent. I use that word, which is so popular amongst globalists. But the church is genuinely interdependent, and it's not a hierarchical or monarchical structure. And this is one of the reasons,
other than God,
rather than Roman Catholics, isn't it? Because
it certainly is. Other than, of course, God and his position as monarch of the church.
Sorry, yeah. I didn't mean. And obviously, we acknowledge that the monarch in the Church of England is the sort of de facto head of our church as well, don't we? So it's a complicated issue, but even.
Well, I think. Yeah.
Even so, she's not a monarchical head in the same way as, say, the Pope is in the Roman Catholic.
She's not even the monarchical head, is she? She's there's very particular wording around what she does, and she's more the monarch of the church remains Christ, and the Queen remains Christ's servant.
Yes, amen. And indeed, the Queen once said when somebody asked her what she would do if Christ returned while she was still alive, she said, "I would take off my crown and lay it down at his feet." Isn't that amazing? I love the Queen. Anyway,
she's got a great faith.
Yeah, absolutely. We're absolutely pro-monarchist in this podcast. I just want to make that absolutely clear to anyone listening. We will not get any anti-monarchist statements here whatsoever, and nor will any guests be welcome if they hold such views. Right, let's look at this. Let's look at a little bit of this.
Do we have to not have Esther back? Is that a problem? I mean, she's American.
Some kind of, but she's an Anglophile, isn't it? She probably wishes she was here so that she could pledge fealty to the Queen. Right, this article, which was in the Daily Telegraph on the 31st of January. Right, so let's listen to this, right? The coronavirus pandemic has provided an opportunity for radical change in the Church of England that could result in the loss of the parish church model, a leaked document suggests. I find that to be a very, very strange constellation of ideas. So the pandemic has provided an opportunity for radical change, right? Number one, that sounds like something out of the Klaus Schwab playbook, doesn't it? This virus has provided we can take up the opportunities that this virus brings to us. Not we need to get everything back to normal as soon as we possibly can for the benefit of the church, but this is our moment to jump in and make radical changes. But the radical changes include the loss of the parish church model. I mean, that's not good. That's not good. That is what the Church of England is based on. That is the Church of England. That is our unique, that's our USP, isn't it? As a church, is that we are a Christian presence in every community, and not just a Christian presence, but an ecclesial presence with priests and sacraments and so on. So not good. Okay. And then, you've already said this thing about the extent of the damage inflicted. This document says many diocesan leaders believe that the financial challenges being exposed by the pandemic mean this is the moment to embark on radical changes, to reshape existing resource patterns and ministry structures, and to invest in developing a more missionally healthy and financially sustainable church. Well, that doesn't mean, I don't even know what that means. What does a more missionally healthy church mean, Tom? Could you pass?
I don't really know, Jamie. I guess a church that actually does mission, but then they don't really define what mission is either. So that's fine, I guess. More mission. It's a problem. The problem is mission is one of those buzzwords.
Yeah.
That the church, the sort of diocesan structures really like these days, and it's very hard to disagree with, because mission is obviously a good thing. We have a mission given to us by Christ, and there are various points at which we can sort of divine bits of that from the Bible. Feed the sick, feed the hungry, heal the sick, clothe the poor. And feed the sick as well. I mean, otherwise they get hungry, and then you have a sick and a hungry person.
Yes.
And
feed and heal them.
But feed and heal them.
Feel them.
And the problem is that's not really. I mean, that should come out as an outflowing of the Holy Spirit in the church. It's not really something you can aim the church at, because it's a byproduct of accepting Christ into your life. It's not and they get this the wrong way around. The sort of causality of mission, which is a result of evangelism, and not a replacement for evangelism.
Yes.
So, and that's the problem, really. If you want to grow your church, you do it by Romans 10, by preaching the gospel.
Yes.
Because if people haven't heard the gospel, they can't follow Christ.
Yes.
And until they follow Christ, they won't be doing the mission of the church. So it's what do they think? They got it the wrong way around. Missionally focused church is a silly way around. Evangelically focused church, and I'm not really talking about evangelical in terms of what sort of music or how your services look. I'm talking about a real intent within the church to preach the gospel.
Yeah. Mission is not achieved through central reorganization. It's a work of the Holy Spirit, isn't it? And I think, I just find this whole idea that the centralized church is going to reshape things to make us more Jesus focused. I just find that, I find that annoying, if I'm honest with you, Tom, because that is not the way that the church works. It works through holiness, through prayer, through devotion, through worship, through sacrifice, through preaching.
Weirdly. Well, absolutely. Weirdly, the same people who make these sort of strange noises, which don't mean much, are the same people who say things like we're too clerical as a church. We need to be declericalizing the church. And you think, well, why would you declericalize the church? Which I kind of agree with, actually. I think there's an awful lot of clericalism going on, which I think is not necessarily healthy. But why would you do that and then just re-centralize it around the bureaucracy instead of a theocracy?
Many of whom actually are clerics themselves.
Yeah. Oh, it's counterproductive, really. I mean, by all means, decentralize the church radically. I'm happy with that. Move away from a clerical kind of thing. I guess so. I could cope with that. I mean, Jamie would probably have other ideas, but that's fine.
It depends what you mean, Tom. I was going to say it is starting to sound quite heretical, but I'm not entirely sure what you mean by that. You're suggesting abolishing priests and bishops?
No. Well, I mean, I think actually making radically more of them would be the key.
Right. Okay. Well, how many?
Well, loads more. Like I'd have bishops, as many bishops as there are deans. Actually make them not, don't pay them anymore. Just make them a post on top of a parish. And then these are the people who are responsible for spiritually guiding your group of sort of 12 or so, rural deans, 12 or so parishes.
Oh, rural deans. Okay.
Yeah. Not cathedral deans. That'd be a waste of time, wouldn't it? And actually it would start looking a lot more, in a congregation, have more than one priest. Why not? Many more deacons. I'd have loads more deacons. Well, that's how I would declericalize.
I mean, this. All right, okay. It's easy to say these things, isn't it? But it's always a question of resources, isn't it? So let's just continue with this for a minute, okay? Because there's some interesting stuff here. The report warns that up to 20% of regular worshippers may never return, and questions the sustainability of many local churches, as well as the continued financial subsidy given to 5,000 loss-making parishes out of the total of 12,000. So this is interesting, isn't it? This estimate that 20% of regular worshippers may never return. I don't know how they've made such an estimation, but I wonder whether it's actually quite an optimistic estimation. I wonder with many churches, they might lose their entire congregations, because their churches may never reopen. And I think it's probably quite likely that in other churches that they would lose a lot more than 20%, particularly if they've had their churches closed for almost a year. I don't know. What's your feel? I mean, obviously we can't know, but what's your sort of gut feeling about that? 20%?
I don't know, Jamie. I mean, there's obviously going to be some losses, and especially, I mean, I hope it's not that many, I must say. But I could see it happening. I think it's hard to know, basically, because in our church, which has been as open as possible, we haven't lost that many, long term.
Right. No, well, neither have we, but both of our churches have been open, apart from when we've been literally forced to shut, haven't they?
Yeah, but there have been churches that literally haven't opened since last May? No, March.
March, yeah.
Which is, and I don't know quite whether they've presumably lost at this point 100% of their congregation. So who knows whether any of them will go back?
Yeah.
Whether they'll reopen.
Yeah, so they're what they're assuming is that 80% will go back, which is not it's not a given, really, is it?
No.
Let's just read out a little bit more from this report. Okay, so there's a bit about online worship. I mean, we've talked about that quite a lot. I have to say, I think online worship is, it's saying, for example, that online worship has so far attracted between 200,000 to 300,000 people. Now, for a start, that's an enormous discrepancy between 200,000 and 300,000 people. I mean, which is it? That's 100,000 people difference, isn't it? So of these, between 100,000 and 200,000 intended to continue either online or in person. Again, very rough figures there. I think this thing about online worship transferring to physical attendance, I think I personally, I don't think that's the way things work. I think online services, particularly stream services, will ultimately be detrimental to people attending, because they'll choose to, some will choose to watch online. So I think the Church of England is actually making a mistake by promoting online worship in this way as a kind of dual track, as another way to garner parishioners or congregants or whatever, because I just don't think that's the way online worship works. But let me read you this bit, Tom. Now, this is the crucial bit here. We are not abandoning the parochial system, which basically says the Church of England has a ministry to everyone in the land, and we want a Christian presence in every community. Now, I'm not sure that that's what the parochial system is, for a start, right? That it says the Church of England has a ministry to everyone in the land, and we want a Christian presence in every community. Well, yeah, in a sense, but what the parochial system is actually about is having a functioning church in every parish, isn't it? So that people have access to the sacraments and to preaching and to ministry where they live. It's not a vague Christian presence. It's more than that. It's about having an established church there. And so here it carries on. What we're doing is looking at other ways of organizing this with local teams, many of whom will either be self-supporting ministers or lay ministers looking after local churches. Local groups of Christians with stipendiary clergy who will be fewer in number, looking after them and sort of managing larger areas, rather like mini bishops. This sounds a bit like what you were suggesting, Tom. Is this
I mean,
involved in this report?
No, I mean, that's the bit which I sort of tend to agree with, although because I think although I'd still maintain a parish priest for every parish, actually, is what I would say, if I could. Whether they be stipendiary. Do you know what, Jamie? I think the stipendiary thing is a bit of a red herring. In the end, if I needed to have another job and serve the church on the side, I wouldn't actually mind doing that. It's perfectly biblical sort of way of organising a church. Paul, remember, made tents whilst he evangelized, and I don't see any particular reason why we need to have paid clergy. Plenty of even Anglican churches around the world make do with either very, very low paid clergy, which they need a job to subsidize it, or no payment at all. And indeed, going back to when glebe was how you paid your clergy, in each parish there was land that was owned by the church. The clergy would have to have farmed it and sort of been part of that farming community as well, which would have taken time up. So yeah, I can kind of agree with that. I don't see a massive problem with that.
Well,
as long as
what you're doing, Tom, is you're just focusing on the stipendiary thing, which, I mean, it does concern me to a certain extent, because I need my stipend to live. But the thing that really worries me is where they say things like we could have lay ministers looking after local churches, which this is the thing. And for listeners who are not Anglicans or not part of Episcopal churches, it might be sort of slightly harder to get this at first, but our identity as Anglicans is that we're an Episcopal church, which means that we have bishops and we have priests, and we don't have lay people primarily celebrating sacraments, because that is a ministry which is focused through the priesthood and the episcopate. So, and we claim and we believe that we are because we have retained these things, we're part of the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, which is in continuity with the first Church of the Apostles, and in unity in some loose but real sense with other Catholic churches around the world. And so if we start going down this road of having lay people looking after churches, we will lose that identity, and we will become simply another Christian group. And we're not saying there's something wrong with being an independent Christian group, but our identity is not that we are an independent Christian group. It's that we're part of the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. And this kind of thing really worries me, because this seems to be the direction that lots of people in the church, particularly sort of corporate bureaucratic types, are pushing us towards, because it would be financially sustainable, more easy to manage, and so on. But this is not our identity as Anglicans, as people in the Church of England. And also, there is no theological rationale for doing this. Whereas we have a theological rationale for the way that we've been set up, which is very well established over the course of 2,000 years. So it's this thing, again, Tom, of this sort of priority of managerialism and bureaucracy over theology and right thought, right thinking about the church. And that is my worry. And you get, Stephen Cottrell, the Archbishop of York, is leading a program to transform the church into what he describes as a Jesus-shaped church, focused on the wider world, which will attract a younger, more ethnically diverse membership. I mean, I just don't know what to say to that. What does that mean? A Jesus-shaped church focused on the wider world, which is specifically looking to attract young people and more ethnically diverse people. What about people of other ages? What about people who are not ethnically diverse? I mean, I don't know, Tom. What do you think about this?
Well, it's a slightly odd thing to want in many ways. I mean, for one thing, you'd expect the church to reflect at any point the congregation it serves. So, we're down here in Poole, for example, it's relatively low numbers of ethnic and minority people. And our church isn't very diverse, but I mean, you wouldn't expect it down here. I mean, there is diversity. There's diversity of thought and diversity of country, not much diversity of skin color. That said, you could make the same claim about the Pentecostal church that meets in Poole, where there isn't, which caters to a mostly black community up in the northern areas of Poole, which. Again, is absolutely fine. I don't know quite why sort of you'd expect a church to serve anything other than the congregation it has. So when you have a church placed into an ethnically diverse area, you would expect it to be ethnically diverse, and if you don't have it, then you would expect it not to be. So, I guess you could say a church that serves its congregation, but ethnic diversity as an aim is a bit strange.
Yeah, and I wonder, Tom, where this thinking comes from. I mean, is this thinking biblical? Does it spring organically from the gospel, or is this thinking based on the way that the world thinks? I mean, in Scripture, it doesn't talk about having younger and more ethnically diverse groups joining the church. It's there's neither slave nor free, nor Greek nor Gentile, male nor female. For all are one in Christ, all are one in the gospel. Christ has broken down the dividing wall of hostility between Jew and Gentile. That's the whole point of the gospel. It's meant to make us one. It's meant to make us value each other, forgive each other, be reconciled with each other. This kind of thing, to my mind, I think it's counterproductive. And I find this idea of a Jesus-shaped church odd as well, because to me, a Jesus-shaped church is the church which Jesus founded on the apostles and which we claim continuity with. We're not just going to suddenly create a Jesus-shaped church. We have inherited a church which is based on a Jesus-shaped church. Sometimes we don't live up to that calling or embody it properly, but that's what our historic ecclesiology is. It's an attempt to be Jesus-shaped. So I find this weird. I don't like this idea of the future of the Church of England being, firstly, lay-led, secondly, focused on online worship. I think this is an absolute betrayal of our identity as Anglicans, and it is not going to work either. That's the other thing. It will not work. Online worship is it's not going to end up with people having transformed lives. They're not going to give money to the church, and the Church of England will just wither away and die. We have to be faithful to what we've been called to do, which is to preach the gospel, minister the sacraments, meet together for worship and prayer and fellowship, and all the things, all the bread and butter, Tom, that we've been doing for the last 2,000 years as Catholic Christians. That's what we should continue to do, because that's what God blesses. You know, Zoom is not going to save the Church of England. So yeah, I feel good that I've got that off my chest, Tom. I think that's the thing that was bubbling up inside of me that I was needing to get in touch with. I mean, do you have any thoughts on that, or should we move on?
I think move on. I think we've covered that well.
Yeah, I feel like I've got something off my chest there. All right, so yeah, I think we should talk about this lockdown debate, this virtual lockdown debate that happened at the Cambridge Union. Now, did you see this, Tom?
I haven't actually had a chance to see it, Jamie, but I do know that the motion was carried, which was that we think that lockdowns were a mistake,
Yes.
Which surprised me, actually, because generally speaking, in these debates, they very rarely come up with sort of truly countercultural sort of victories, is my experience of watching them.
Yeah.
They usually, you know, the sort of prevailing narrative is the one that wins. You might get some good arguments both ways, but generally the prevailing narrative is the one that wins. And for me, you know, having for a long time been sort of at the losing end of this argument, to find a public forum like that with skeptical and bright young minds, you know, in a fair and well kind of ordered discussion, to see the lockdown debate being brought out and then actually being not just coming close but actually winning, it has heartened me, although I have not had a chance to watch it myself. Yeah.
Well, I think you should watch this debate. There was a similar one, the Oxford Union, it was about 9 months ago. It was during the first lockdown, which was good. But this one was a lot better, I have to say. So Cambridge Union, this House believes lockdown was a mistake. The motion was carried by a 54% majority. So it was a really good result for the anti-lockdown position, or the pro-freedom position, you might call it. I thought that the ones who were arguing in favour of the motion were excellent. I have to say, Graham Brady was there. He was so impressive, Tom. I have to say, he made a point of information right at the end, and honestly, he was really polite, but at the same time so penetrating in his analysis. And Toby Young, honestly, his speech was about 20 minutes and it was excoriating. He absolutely destroyed the pro-lockdown argument, I would say. He was seriously impressive, and he gave the impression of a man who's lived and breathed this for almost a year now. I mean, he was really on it with all of his statistics and information and everything. So it really is worth watching. And if you're even slightly open-minded about the whole concept of lockdowns, I think it really is a must-watch to see both sides given a fair hearing. But Tom, if I may, I'd like to just mention the three people who spoke for the lockdown, because I think this is quite an interesting. It's quite interesting what some of the things that were said. So the first lady was Laura Spinney, who apparently has written, I think she's written a history of the Spanish flu. Now, one of the points that she tried to make is that lockdown is not unprecedented historically. And she basically tried to make the point that lockdown has taken various forms at various different times, but essentially it's always been something that people have resorted to. Now, she actually defined lockdown in her speech as a quarantine of the sick, and she also talks about cordon sanitaire. Now, Toby Young actually took her up on this and said that there has never been anything resembling what's happening now, really, in history. There have been things which have approached it for a very limited period of time, such as in St. Louis, apparently, there was some shutdown, but it only lasted 48 hours. In Mexico, something happened as well, which was a 17-day, but they abandoned it because it was so damaging. So the idea that there's been a lockdown which has lasted for almost a year, or on and off, is completely false.
But also, I mean, we should really point out that quarantine of the sick is a reasonable
Yeah.
public health
Yeah.
measure. You know, I don't think anyone would argue against that.
No, no, no.
It's the quarantine of the healthy that defines the lockdowns as we've experienced them, and that is very different.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, absolutely. And that was one of the reasons I think that these guys won the debate, is that they made this point over and over again, that this is just not necessary. There are other things you could have done which would have been more effective, or just as effective, more or less, and which wouldn't have done these terrible damages which the lockdown has done. So it's that kind of sleight of hand, which actually Klaus Schwab does a similar thing in his book, COVID-19, The Great Reset, is he tries to make out that this has happened loads of times before, which it actually hasn't. This is unprecedented. And this is the thing, they always try and say, well, this is an unprecedented virus, therefore we need to use these semi-precedented measures. But actually, the truth is that we've had plagues and viruses before, and we've never done this. So Toby Young really took her up on that. She didn't address any of the ethical or political questions that a government doing this raises. And she said that if we'd locked down harder and longer, it would have had a greater effect. And she says that we should have emulated China, and then we would be free now, which I thought was interesting, because the Chinese people aren't really free because they live under a dictatorial communist regime with a social credit system. So
also, as I understand it, they went back into lockdown, didn't they? Quite recently, they've had a resurgence of cases and effectively had to call lockdown again on at least one town, which you know.
Yeah, well, I mean, this one, I thought the first one, Laura Spinney, was particularly bad because she didn't really explain, unlike the next two I'm about to talk about, she didn't explain how lockdown is supposed to achieve these ends, because the problem has always been, hasn't it, that you lock down, but then what do you do afterwards? You know, all right, lock down harder, but why? What's the point? What are you going to do? She quoted, and yeah, again, this thing about China, I think that this is, you know, Tom, this is totally naive, isn't it? You know, if you're happy to turn your country into a dictatorial, authoritarian police state where nobody has any individual rights, then you probably can control the virus, but it would mean an end to civilized life. She defines freedom as freedom from pestilence, and she quotes Camus, the pest, and Camus said something like in that book, we will never be free until we're free from the plague, or something like that. And again, I mean, it's interesting from a theological perspective, isn't it? Because as people who believe in Christ, we believe that Christ sets us free from sin and from the fear of death and from death itself, and that's what true freedom is. But for somebody like Camus, and I read Le Peste, like I said this a few weeks ago, didn't I? And I have to say, I found it really, really banal. I found it really boring, actually, and I thought Camus was. I really just didn't think he had anything interesting to say, although the book is described very well, but you know, it's a very depressing situation he's describing. But essentially, Camus has people doing heroic things for no real reason, and they even say that they don't have a reason to do these things, but they do them just because, you know, just out of some kind of vague humanism or something like that. So I think that this idea that freedom is just freedom from the plague, you know, freedom from the fear of a virus, I think that that's a very, very empty and thin understanding of freedom, really.
Well, indeed, I mean, any reasonable discussion of freedom needs to talk about the risks that come with that freedom. And you could just as easily define freedom as free from being hit by a car, and then ban all driving, or free from the ills of alcohol and ban all alcohol, you know, and then say, well, we're freer. You haven't got cars, you haven't got drink. You're a free person. You haven't got any. You're going to be fine. But actually, you're less free than you were. So I think you know, I think that sort of argument is just, it's pointless. You know,
Yeah.
you can't talk to people who think that way.
Yeah, of course, and also from a straightforward kind of liberal political position, I think you'd probably define freedom as something like the capacity to make decisions for yourself as to how you are going to go about your own life. I mean, you'd probably define freedom like that, wouldn't you?
Yeah,
Um,
or maybe the sort of that sort of hallowed common law kind of idea of being free to do whatever the government says. You know, whatever the government doesn't legislate, you're free to do, which is you know, and then you know, agitate for a small state that doesn't deem it necessary to make too many rules. Basically, that's
yeah,
how freedom was used to work. The state said that various things were wrong, based on a sort of common understanding of moral codes. You know, murder, theft, fraud.
yeah,
And as long as you didn't do those things, which again came from a common set of moral codes, in our case, Christian codes, you were free to do, you know, whatever you liked. And I think that's probably a good place to be. It's a place we were. It's a place I thought I was until a year ago.
yeah. It's quite interesting actually, Tom, because I was listening to another podcast where they were discussing Dostoevsky's story in the Brothers Karamazov about the Grand Inquisitor, and basically the Grand Inquisitor accuses Christ of wanting to make people free, and the point that he's making is that people are a lot better off in his eyes when they're not free, because they don't have the burden and the responsibility of making decisions for themselves, and this brings a kind of peace. So if you give yourself over to servitude, if you basically say, look, I'm not going to make the decisions myself anymore, I'm going to give that power to, for example, the people in number 10 Downing Street, it kind of relieves you, because you no longer have any sort of moral agency. All you have to do is follow the rules, right? But if you say, well, no, actually, I'm going to take responsibility myself to make my own decisions, and thank you very much, Boris Johnson, but I don't want you making my decisions for me. I'd like to make my decisions based on my own sense of responsibility, or whatever it might be. That gives you a sense of responsibility, doesn't it? It gives you a sense of agency and of being a moral agent, but at the same time it carries with it a risk. And I think that this is what's happened in our culture, is that people have said, right, we don't want the risk anymore. We don't want the risk of making somebody unhealthy, or of transmitting the virus, or of contracting the virus ourselves. So we will give that decision over to you, and then that's how we'll live. But that's bondage. That's not freedom. Sorry, carry on.
No, and I mean, do you know, it seems that we don't, and it's the one thing that that I think Sweden shows, is that trusting a population to take, I mean, it's, you know, to take some steps is possible, you know, and you know, not only possible, but didn't lead to substantially worse outcomes than we saw here, or indeed actually their deaths per million are better. But
yeah.
But that's, you know.
Sorry, you go ahead.
Yeah. So in all, like, you know, the idea that we shouldn't be making, you know, we shouldn't be treated as adults, as capable of making our own choice, of you know, of deciding our own risk, and managing that is a really awful way of being governed. And it's one that shouldn't have, we said this before, it should never have been contemplated in a common law system. It's ripped straight out of the playbook of totalitarianistic states. We thought we were better than that. We're clearly not, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. Tom, I do apologize for trying to interrupt you then twice. It was very wrong of me. But it reminded me of the next speaker I wanted to talk about, who's Phil Whittaker, who interestingly said, he claimed, now I think he basically lost the debate on this point, right? Because he said that lockdowns work, and you can see it from the numbers declining, right? And he specifically was talking about the first lockdown here. But he admits that the numbers started declining before the first lockdown was called, right? And he said that was because people started to impose their own lockdowns. That for me concedes everything, doesn't it?
It does concede the point.
He's essentially saying that people can take responsibility for themselves.
I mean, yeah, it does, certainly. And also, I mean, it's worth, you know, yes and no. I mean, it was declining, the reproduction rate was declining from long before that. You know, if you look at the rate of growth of the epidemic, it was dropping before any government sort of intervention started to happen. When I remember being in a crowded restaurant, sharing tapas with two friends, possibly the least COVID-friendly meal, full of people. And that was 2 weeks just before the great toilet roll run happened, which was at the beginning of March. So it's the last weekend of February, so pretty much a year ago. And, people weren't changing their behaviour then, at least down in Poole. And at its prime sort of virus sort of gathering and exchanging kind of situations. Indeed, I had a respiratory virus for the whole of that month. But whether it was COVID, I don't know. Maybe I even had long COVID. You never know. Who knows?
Yeah.
But I agree with you. It does concede the point. If people can be trusted to make changes, then all that we needed was the voluntary system before lockdown came in. And imagine if the government had held its nerve.
Yeah.
Just imagine. And everything from that point would be voluntary.
Yeah.
Yeah,
and that was one of the themes of this debate, is that basically everybody who was arguing for the lockdown wasn't really 100% arguing for the lockdown. They were arguing for quite reasonably extreme measures, but all of them in various different ways could have been arguing for something less than a lockdown, where personal responsibility was assumed. And indeed, just to jump ahead, the very ends, when Layla Moran was talking, at the very ends, the Conservative MP Nigel Brady challenged her about this, and she basically conceded the point completely. At the end, she basically says, yeah, I think people should have been given responsibility, and they should have been told to, please stay at home, but they shouldn't have been criminalized, which essentially concedes the whole debate, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So just to finish off with this, so Phil Whittaker, basically, he's a scientist, and he basically was he gave a very informative speech about the dangers associated with COVID. And he basically said, if you can't track and trace, you must lock down to stop it. But as I said, he basically conceded the point by saying that people were doing their own lockdowns prior to the first lockdown. He didn't address the ethics of lockdown, but he also didn't address the possibility that you could ask people with symptoms to isolate, you could shut the borders, you could get people to wash their hands more, etc., and that might do as much. For him, he was saying it has to be a government intervention. But like I said, he did really concede the points. Although he thought the first lockdown was not a mistake, he also said that the government has utterly failed in not bringing in targeted measures, and describes the third lockdown as reckless. So basically what he said was the first lockdown was necessary, but the government should have used that time in order to bring in those secondary, less harsh measures like track and trace and isolate, and they failed to do that. And there was no point opening up after the first lockdown if those measures weren't in place, because we just have to go back into it, which I think is a fair point, really.
Well, I think that ignores the fact that they don't really work as measures. I think there's a problem there. But where the track and trace didn't work in Germany, where it was supposed to be, amazingly effective, and it just didn't work in the end.
And when I said it was a fair point, I just meant that there's a sort of incoherence built into the plan of just locking down for a certain amount of time until the infections came down, and then opening up again without really changing anything.
I guess so.
Like you, Tom, I think what should have happened is that people should have been given the information that they needed, particularly people who are vulnerable. They should have been told to wash their hands more. They should have been told that if they had symptoms, they had to isolate. And you give people agency in that, and it would be more effective as well. You can see that this track and trace system with these mobile phones, absolutely ridiculous, and it isn't working. No. So you tell people, look, if you have symptoms of COVID, self-isolate. Give people the opportunity to listen and to follow instructions in a responsible way. That would be far more efficient than trying to control everything centrally with these stupid apps, which Hancock and Boris Johnson seem to listen to, but nobody else does. And they've already had the virus. I mean, it's a case in point of the way that centralized government like this, when they try and do everything from the center, it just doesn't work. It's far more efficient to empower your population. So anyway, Then the third one, Lena Moran, who's a Lib Dem MP. I felt her speech was the weakest of the three because it was very sort of it was very haphazard. You know, so for example, she repeated that 100,000 dead figure and asked, you know, where is their freedom? Now we actually didn't mention this on the show last week, but there was this figure that 100,000 people had died from COVID, and this has been repeated many times in the press. Now, to me, I mean, this is a kind of a sidetrack here, Tom, but this thing about 100,000 people dying from COVID, this is, I think, a slightly misleading figure, isn't it? Because it's not actually people who have died directly from COVID, but people who have died within 28 days of having a positive COVID test. Is that right?
I think that's right. But I mean, you know, we all know that the gold standard of death measurement, so to speak, is excess deaths. Now it has its own problems, but even in excess deaths, we're nowhere near 100,000 deaths. It's not there. It's not there yet. So which means that some of those 100,000 would have probably died of something else anyway. But look, I mean, it's a pointless argument to make because it doesn't address the efficiency of lockdown in addressing the problem, and it doesn't address the fact that there are plenty of states around the world which managed to contain this virus with many fewer problems, but with fewer measures. And it also doesn't address the fact that you know, while 100,000 people might have died of COVID, the government have suggested that 100,000 people will die of the lockdown as well. So yeah. I mean, it's pretty ghastly. The government also claimed that without the lockdown, another 150,000 people would have died. But that's, you know, whether that's true or not is up for debate.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about that figure. It's interesting again that she defined freedom at the beginning of her speech as collective responsibility. And the MP, Brady, picked her up on this at the end and said, this isn't collective responsibility, what's happening at the moment. This is coercion and criminalization and authoritarian control. And she basically conceded that point, which I thought was very interesting. But it's part of what these arguments are, you know, this 100,000 dead thing. And then at the end, she started doing that sort of, you know, I asked my opponents in this debate, how many more people would have been acceptable, how many more deaths would have been acceptable to you, and all this kind of stuff. And really, this is kind of missing the point. And I think this is why these people lost the debate, is that the opponents weren't saying we should just sacrifice everyone to COVID and have our individual freedom. They were saying that the response is disproportionate, it's illiberal, it's unethical, and it's going to do more harm than good overall. But what the pro-lockdown position was trying to do is saying, well, essentially COVID is very bad, therefore we need a lockdown, and look how bad it is. And almost it's a sort of emotional pressure almost to sort of, you know, it's a kind of, to make you think in a way which is sort of irrational, like this. It's almost an attempt to generate panic. You know, 100,000 are dead. Oh, well, of course I support the lockdown, you know, because it's the most extreme thing that you can support. But actually, we need to have a balanced approach to this, and an approach which takes into account everybody in society. Sorry,
it's still certainly the case that that you have to ask what is the alternative? It is not no sort of interventions at all. It is simply more liberal interventions, and it would have brought down the virus numbers as well. We know this because I mean there's a great chart in Lockdown Skeptics that shows you know, all of the American states, including the ones which didn't lock down and the ones which did lock down, and there's something like 10% different in deaths, or 15% difference in deaths. So slightly more deadly to those that didn't lock down from in the short term. But in the long term, the economy of those and the preservation of the ability to thrive are not small things. You know, they're not. It's not easy to say, well, how many deaths is the ability to thrive worth? You know, it's not very easy to say questions like that. But certainly, we generally accept a certain number of deaths for, say, driving to be allowed to happen, or going on holiday. You even, there's a certain amount of death and injury in every Amazon purchase you make when it arrives. The dangerous places to work, shipping industry, and the transport industry. We sort of we ignore them because we don't see them, but actually, our lifestyles has always required. You're back. Hello. Did something happen there?
No, I'm here.
Okay. Our life has always required risk and danger in order to preserve, and indeed liberty is always has always needed sacrifice.
Yeah.
And we knew that back in World War II, where we sent hundreds of thousands of people off to fight against totalitarianistic fascism. We knew that would cost lives, and we thought that it was worth it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and you could equally turn it around, couldn't you? With this, I'm sure you've come across this. How many more deaths would have been acceptable? Well, you could say exactly the same thing about the deaths that are caused by the lockdown, and how many more children's education and futures are acceptable sacrifice to make. How many old folks dying alone in their care homes, separated from those who they love, and so on and so forth. You could play exactly the same game the other way around. But yeah, let's move on to just talk about some correspondence in a minute. But just to round that out, I think that is an excellent debate to watch, and I think anyone who's watching it with a fair and open mind can see that the motion, the arguments for the motion were very, very strong, and the motions against it ultimately were weak because they didn't argue for the lockdown in its totality and actually conceded that it wasn't, in many ways, that it wasn't necessary. So do get hold of that. Just to move on from that, because this is actually relevant. Now, our watchers, people who are watching this, will see that I'm about to share a screen with Tom. So here we go. There's somebody who sent me this helpful graph, because if the listeners will recall, we were talking about the amount of people who have died this year. My MP claimed that we now have the most deaths happening since the Second World War. And so Tom and I, can you see the graph, Tom?
I can see the graph. Yeah.
The technology is working. I hope it's being filmed as well via Zoom. I think it will be. But basically, we're looking at a graph. Rowena sent us this, so thanks, Rowena. A graph with a grey line indicating deaths and a red line indicating deaths per million. Now, Tom, you correct me if I'm wrong, but as I'm looking at this, it does seem that we have a high death rate this in 2020. Something like, what's that number there? It's 600,000 deaths, isn't it? And it is high. It's higher than it was in 1940. And indeed all the way through the Second World War. But it looks to me like it's also as high as it was in 1976 as well. And more to the point, the deaths per million for 2020 is just above 450,000, which is higher than it has been for about, 12 or about 15, 16 years or something like that. But prior to the year 2000, deaths per million have been higher for 100 years. So, I mean, is that your reading of that graph as well?
Yeah, I mean, it's a sort of it's a very interesting one. Basically, you take raw deaths, and of course, the trend is to increase. The number of deaths will increase as our population increases, but that's not the whole story. You need to divide it by the number of people that were alive at the one time to find a consistent measure, and so by that measure, by this raw deaths per million measure, you have the death rate in 2020 roughly equivalent to the one we saw in 2003.
Yeah.
Even though our deaths are a lot higher. It's interesting to see that the death rate has been increasing in the last few years. There's a pattern there. But which means that this idea that we're constantly decreasing is wrong. And of course, you can't constantly decrease forever because you'd end up with immortality. I think the other thing of noting actually is that these haven't been age standardized, which is another thing the ONS do, which actually makes it look even less problematic, and you end up with 2020 being akin to sort of 2008. Age standardized basically takes the death rate and applies a consistent formula that makes it comparable, because not only does our population increase, but also it's been getting older, and as a population gets older, the death rate will increase. But that said, I mean, yes, we saw a spike in deaths last year. There was a pandemic. Whether it would have been vastly worse than before without lockdown, and how many of those deaths are indeed lockdown deaths is another question. But yes,
yeah. So in 1940, deaths per million, which presumably is the figure on the right hand side, is something.
Yes, on the right hand side, yeah,
it's just above 14,000, which is the high peak of the Second World War. Here, this 2020, it's just above 10,000. So,
and it's worth noting that the 1918 flu gives you a peak of 18,000, enormous numbers of people dying without any requirement of the government to lock people in their homes.
Yeah, and presumably 1915 as well as the First World War, which is 16,000 per million. I don't know what 1903 is. That's very high as well. That's well above 16,000 per million. So so it's interesting. That's interesting, isn't it? But I think, Tom, that sort of comprehensively puts paid to this idea that we've seen the most deaths since the Second World War, proportionally speaking. I mean, it may be sort of technically true, but it's massively misleading, isn't it? Because of the size of the population.
It's almost double what it was then. Yeah, hugely misleading.
Yeah, so I mean, it's important to try and put these things into context. So thank you very much, Rowena, for that. That was really good, and I hope that's actually worked with the technology as well. It'd be really good if it has. So I just finished. Let's finish in a minute, Tom, because we've been going for ages, and I'm desperate for the loo, I have to say. But a couple of emails we've had, and we've had a few emails actually, and I'll save some over for next week. But one from James, who writes in, says, "Thanks so much for the podcast. Discovered it on Lockdown Skeptics. Listened to the last two of our pods, and he's been enthralled." Tom, can you believe that somebody's been enthralled by listening to us? I mean, I hasten to add that I'm always enthralled listening to you.
I must say, I do apologise if anyone's get to this point and is very disappointed about my diatribe on Gleebland, because that might put people off, Jamie. I often find that my interests do not align well with the rest of society's.
Well, they're doing right at the moment, Tom, because we are growing. Our listener is growing, definitely. So anyway, he says, "It's so good to hear that there are other Christians out there who think as I do." He's a retired reader, and he spent his career running international companies. He writes, "I hope you won't object, but I published a link to your site on my blog on my own site, which is www.reflectivepreacher. Well, since not only do we not mind, James, but we're going to put a link to your blog on our show and repay the favor. But we're very, very happy for people to share us around." He writes, "Life is very hard for so many people at the moment. Thank you for giving us hope, a great Christian virtue. I'm sure you're both very busy, so please don't feel that you need to reply," and so on. I did reply, and we had some good correspondence. And he wrote here in a subsequent email that he spent 7 years as director of the Historic Churches Preservation Trust.
In Bristol.
Is it based in Bristol?
Well, they certainly had an office there. Yeah, they're great. They keep some wonderful churches going.
Yeah, absolutely.
And they're all consecrated as well. It's really nice. So they do have a yearly service in all of them, and make sure they do.
Was that right? Okay, yeah. So it now calls itself the National Churches Trust, apparently. He says he worked with Andrew Lloyd Webber and his son-in-law, Adam Gurdon, for years, trying to encourage churches to unlock their doors. He wrote an article in the Church Time called "First Unlock Your Churches. I fear that all the effort may have been in vain, but I pray not, because people need faith more than ever now." Somebody who's dedicated himself to our legacy and the gift that we have for ourselves and for our nation of our historic churches. And we also pray that our church buildings are not lost, but that they are filled with worshippers and used as they were intended to be used when built. So thank you very much, James, for getting in touch. Please do stay in touch with the show. We also have another email from somebody who says that she's been intending to get in touch for a while to say a massive thank you for starting the podcast. "Having felt for a long time that either the world around me was going mad," I know that feeling, as I'm sure you do as well, Tom, "or I was. It was such a relief to find two Anglican clergy and guests discussing the whole crisis rationally and, importantly, theologically. Hearing you both voice the thoughts that I've been having myself has been so encouraging, and I don't feel quite so alone. She still hasn't got over the shock of the announcement back in March that the churches would close. And I also, this is her saying this, I also regard the whole response of the CofE to the pandemic with a sense of disbelief. If we have nothing to say about the threat, suffering and death, then what are we for? Back in March, I remember thinking clearly, who wants all the churches to close? What spiritual forces want to destroy our communion with God and our communion with each other? As well as staying open to offering people consolation and prayer for the world, should we also be recognizing a spiritual battle here that needs to be fought?
I think so.
Yeah, absolutely. I've been feeling at a bit of a loss. I know my faith doesn't depend on what my local church or the Church of England does, but where does that leave the ordinary believer when it seems physical church attendance and the sacraments are not important? I've attended my church a few times, but find myself unable to go back. We can only fit a few people in, the rest joining in via Zoom. At the start of the service, reminded how to approach the altar for communion, reminded strongly not to stop and talk even outside after the service. We are to approach the altar, remove masks, sanitize hands, receive the bread. No words can be spoken. The priest does not say, "This is my body," and we are not allowed to say Amen. We put our masks back on, sanitize once more, and back to our seats. After the last time, I felt I couldn't do it anymore. I just couldn't stand there before the altar where we remember Christ who died for us, who defeated death by death, and be afraid to speak. She mentions she mentions a link I put on Twitter as well, which I'll mention in a minute. She also talks about the cathedral of her diocese, which offers vaccinations but not the Eucharist, and says she is at a loss for words when she sees this kind of thing happening. There aren't many people she can talk to about this, as I fear the current narrative is too deeply embedded. So thanks for reading, and so on. Well, thank you very much. I'm going to keep her anonymous for reasons I won't say, but it's really good to hear from you, and please do keep in touch. And I know that lots of people feel a similar way. I think it's really hard for parishioners, isn't it, Tom, who are in this situation where they really feel that even if their churches are open, they're often very, I don't know, very, very strict, regulated, controlled, joyless environments, and it is very tough for people.
Yeah, and I mean, it's, you know, you really don't need to. I mean, who knows why the priest feels the need to do that, but you know, frankly, once people have done it a couple of times, that you don't need to remind people over and over again. And I don't know why it's their business to remind people not to talk after the service. I mean, that's entirely none of my business. Once people are outside of the church, it is their. They can be a guide to their own required morality. I don't know.
Yeah, and you have to wonder about the mindset of priests who are enforcing rules in this way. I mean, it's not only is it over the top, but it's ultimately going to drive people away, and it's going to be counterproductive. And if you're going to treat people like that, I mean, it's only going to result in one thing, really, isn't it? It's probably appropriate here to plug the UK lockdownchurches.wordpress.com website, which we've done a lot. If you're looking for an open church which is near you, perhaps you're in a similar situation to some of our correspondents, have a look at that website. It's run by a friend of the show, Andy. www.uklockdownchurches.wordpress.com, and there are a good number of churches there, and there might be one that's near you, which might and it might help you to connect. And indeed, if you have a church that's open, you can go on there and register that church. But for some people that might be helpful. I've got another email here from Rosemary. I think Rosemary, this email is so good, Tom. I think we're going to save it till next week, because I'm honestly desperate for the toilet now, and we've been going for quite a long time. I think we're over an hour and a half. So let's stop there. Rosemary, thank you so much for your emails. We'll read them next week and save a proper amount of time for them. But yeah, Tom, it's been a good show, I think.
It's been wonderful. Well, goodbye everyone, and stay sane. Don't do too much of the news, you know.
Absolutely. Well, Tom, I think we should say, instead of, this rubbish about, keep safe and all this kind of stuff, right? I think we should remember the exhortation from the book of Jude, where Jude says, keep yourself in the love of God. And that's really what we should be doing as followers of Christ. Keep yourself in the love of God. Know God's love in your mind, in your heart. Seek him in prayer. Seek his peace. Ultimately, this is what keeps us sane. This is what keeps us happy. This is what keeps us in eternal life, is to know God and Jesus Christ, who is sent to the earth. So listeners, keep yourself in the love of God above all else. Obviously, try and be safe, try and be responsible, but above all else, know the love of God in your life.
Yep.
Tom, it's been great, as always. A pleasure
As
and a privilege to talk to you. And I hope you get back to your flock, who have presumably been waiting for you to go in there and take a really good Eucharist service. So I hope you have a good time.
I will. All right.
All right. God bless.
Cheerio then.
Bye now. Bye-bye.